Tonight, we're going to talk about Concorde, the aircraft that flew at twice the speed of sound and served airline passengers for 27 years before it was retired. The aircraft most of us have only seen in photographs, even though it was still flying within the lifetime of anyone listening over the age of 25. We'll spend a long, quiet stretch together. We'll start in Paris in 1962, when two governments, one French, one British, signed a treaty to build it. We'll walk through the design, the engines, the strange engineering problems of moving an airliner through the air at 2,000 kilometers an hour. We'll be in Toulouse on a cold morning in 1969, watching the first prototype lift off the runway. We'll be in the cabin at 60,000 feet, where the window beside your seat is warm to the touch, even though it's 50 below outside. We'll be in Paris again on a quiet day in 2000, when an accident on a runway changed everything. And we'll be at Heathrow in October of 2003, when the last commercial supersonic airliner taxied to the stand and the tower welcomed her home for the last time. You don't need to remember any of it. There won't be a quiz at the end. This is meant to be listened to with the lights off and your eyes closed. The facts are here for you if you want them, and easy to drift past if you don't. This is long enough to settle in, drift off, and come back whenever you want. The aircraft flew for 27 years. The world had one of these once. Let's begin where it actually began, with the engineers and committees on both sides of the channel, who in the middle of the 1950s started working on the same problem at the same time. In the early 1950s, the world's airlines were buying jets for the first time. The de Havilland Comet had entered service in 1952. The Boeing 707 would come in 1958. These were aircraft that could cross the Atlantic in 7 hours instead of 15. And the people who ran airlines and the people who built airliners looked at the numbers and decided that the next thing on the list was speed. It seemed obvious. Range had gone up. Capacity had gone up. The natural next axis of competition was how fast the aircraft moved. And there had been military aircraft flying faster than sound since 1947. The North American X-1, the Bell X-2, the Avro 707 in Britain, the MiG-15 in the Soviet Union, the technical envelope had already been opened. The question was whether you could build something supersonic that carried 100 people in business suits and made money doing it. In 1956, two committees started working on that question separately in two different countries. In Britain, the Ministry of Supply set up a body called the Supersonic Transport Aircraft Committee, STAC for short. It was chaired by Sir Morian Morgan of the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. And its job was to look at the engineering and figure out whether a supersonic airliner was buildable. The committee included representatives from Bristol Aircraft, from Vickers, from Hawker Siddeley, from de Havilland, from Handley Page. All the British aircraft manufacturers of the period sat down in a room together and started drawing. In France, the work was happening at Sud Aviation in Toulouse, under a designer named Lucien Cerventy. The French government had its own ideas about supersonic transport, and Sud Aviation had its own funding line. By the late 1950s, both groups had converged on the same general shape: slender delta wing, long thin fuselage, 4 engines, 2 crew, around 100 passengers, cruise at roughly Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, at 60,000 feet, where the air is thin enough that the drag becomes manageable. The British design was called the Bristol 223. The French design was called the Super Caravelle. They were almost the same aircraft, Both governments looked at the cost estimates and reached the same conclusion at almost the same time. Neither country could afford to build the thing on its own. The development cost was projected at £170 million in 1962 money. By the time the program was finished, it would actually be more than £1 billion. But even the early estimate was more than either national budget could swallow alone. So there were quiet conversations. Then there were less quiet conversations. Then in October 1962, the Minister of Aviation in Britain, Julian Amery, flew to Paris and sat down with the French Minister of Public Works, Robert Burin, and the two of them agreed on the framework, a joint development program, equal shares of the cost and equal shares of the work, engines built in the United Kingdom, airframes shared between the two countries, final assembly in both Toulouse and Filton. The formal agreement was signed on the 29th of November, 1962. It's worth pausing on that document for a moment because it wasn't a contract, it was a treaty, a binding agreement between two sovereign governments with no exit clause. Neither side could walk away from it without the consent of the other. That decision to write the agreement as an intergovernmental treaty rather than as a commercial development contract would matter more than anyone realized at the time. It is the reason the Concorde program survived the next 10 years. Without that clause, the aircraft would have been canceled twice over. The first cancellation attempt came in 1964. The Labour Party won the British general election, and Harold Wilson's new government inherited a program they had not authorized and did not particularly want. The British half of the project was over budget, and Britain in 1964 had bigger financial problems than it had aerospace ambitions. Wilson's cabinet voted to cancel the program. They informed the French. The French refused. The treaty had no exit clause. Britain would have to either continue or face international legal action and the collapse of every other Anglo-French partnership in progress at the time. Britain continued. The second cancellation attempt came in 1967 when the British government reviewed the program again. Costs had doubled. Costs would double again. The Treasury wanted out. The same conversation happened. The French refused. The treaty had no exit clause. Britain continued. This was the program's secret weapon. It couldn't be killed. It had been designed to be uncancelable in the way that some buildings are designed to be unfallable. Whether that was a good thing in the end depends on how you feel about the aircraft itself. The work began in earnest in 1963. The British side was led by Bristol Aircraft Company, which by 1960 had merged with several other firms to become BAC, the British Aircraft Corporation. The French side was Sud Aviation, which would in 1970 merge with Nord Aviation and become Aerospatiale. The two sides agreed to a shared engineering language, English for the technical documents, French for the procurement contracts. The conversion between metric and imperial units was a small daily problem that never quite went away. There are stories of components arriving from one country that didn't quite fit the components arriving from the other because someone had carried the conversion to one too few decimal places. These were eventually solved by simply working in metric throughout the airframe and in imperial for the cockpit instruments, which is how the Concorde ended up with airspeed indicators that read in knots, but a fuel system that read in kilograms. The cultural strain between Bristol and Toulouse was real, but it was managed. Engineers from both countries spent months at a time in each other's offices. Children were enrolled in local schools on both sides of the channel. A regular shuttle flight ran between Filton and Toulouse for the engineering teams. There are former Concorde engineers, now in their 80s, who can still tell you the year they bought their house in Bristol or the year they moved their family to France, because the program reorganized their lives. The first full-scale mock-up was completed at Filton in 1963 and shown to the press. It was sleek and white and unmistakably new. The fuselage was at 90% of the length the production aircraft would eventually reach. The nose was already drooped, the famous mechanism that lets the pilot see the runway on landing, because the aircraft's high angle of attack at low speed otherwise blocks all forward visibility. And the windows were already the small rectangles they would always be, the size of paperback books. There was an argument in those early years over the name. The aircraft had been called Concorde, with a final letter E from the French side from the beginning. The word means harmony, agreement, in both French and English. It was a diplomatic name. It was the name of the program as much as the aircraft. But in Britain in 1965, the new government had decided, for reasons of national pride, that the spelling should drop the E and become Concorde. The British press used the shortened form for 2 years. Then in December 1967, at a ceremony in Toulouse marking the rollout of the first prototype, the British Minister of Technology, Tony Benn, gave a speech in which he announced that the E was being restored to the British spelling as well. The E, he said, stood for Excellence, England, Europe, and Entente. The French press, which had been quietly furious for 2 years, found this acceptable. By the end of 1967, the program had a name, a treaty, 2 governments that couldn't get out of it, a prototype rolled out and almost ready to fly, and an engineering culture that had spent 5 years learning how to work across a language barrier without falling over. The thing they had built, the thing they were about to start flying, was strange. Let's look at it. Concorde was designed to cruise at Mach 204. That is 2.04 times the speed of sound, or roughly 2,100 kilometers an hour, or 1,300 miles an hour, at 60,000 feet. The first question, when you sit down to design an airliner that will fly that fast for hours at a time, is not how fast it will go. The first question is what temperature the metal will be when it gets there, because the air moving past the skin of the aircraft doesn't just push on the aluminum, it heats it. At sea level, the speed of sound is roughly 340 meters per second. At 60,000 feet, in much colder air, it's closer to 295. When you push an aircraft through that air at twice the speed of sound, the air compresses against the leading edges of the wings, against the nose, against every forward-facing surface, and that compression turns into heat. It's the same thing that happens to a meteor entering the atmosphere. Although the meteor is moving 20 times faster and accordingly is far hotter. At Mach 204, in standard atmospheric conditions, the surface of the Concorde reaches 127 degrees Celsius at the stagnation point on the nose. That's 260 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to give you a burn through a glove. Along the leading edges of the wings, the temperature is closer to 100 degrees Celsius. Toward the trailing edges of the wings, 90. Toward the tail, 90. 127 degrees Celsius is the upper limit. It is exactly the upper limit, in fact, because the aluminum that the Concorde was made of cannot tolerate sustained operation at any higher temperature without losing its strength. The specific alloy used was called R58, Rolls-Royce 58, a copper magnesium iron nickel titanium aluminum alloy Originally developed for piston engine cylinder heads in the 1930s because it could handle high temperatures without softening. The Concorde program adopted it because it was the only off-the-shelf aluminum alloy in 1962 that could survive a multi-hour cruise at Mach 2. This is why Concorde never flew faster than Mach 2.04. The number was not chosen for performance reasons. It was chosen because it was the fastest the airframe could go without melting. Anything faster than that would have required titanium, which is what the American SST program proposed to use, and what the Soviet Tu-144 partially used, and what the SR-71 Blackbird used. Titanium cost roughly 10 times what aluminum did. Working with it cost 10 times what working with aluminum did. The British and French treasuries had agreed to fund an aluminum aircraft, so Concorde was an aluminum aircraft, and it cruised at Mach 2.04 forever in every flight it ever made. The wing was a delta, or more specifically, an ogival delta, a slender delta with a curved leading edge that swept back from the nose at a sharp angle, then curved more gently toward the wingtip. This shape was the result of years of wind tunnel work at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Bedford and at Sud Aviation in Toulouse, looking for the wing planform that would give acceptable performance both at supersonic cruise and at the low speeds needed for takeoff and landing. A normal airliner wing doesn't really work at supersonic speeds. The straight planform produces too much drag. The American B-58 Hustler bomber and the F-104 Starfighter, both supersonic, used radically different wings than Boeing's of the same era. The Concorde team considered a swing wing design, a wing that would extend forward at low speeds like a duck's foot opening and retract for supersonic cruise. This is the design the Soviet Tu-144 prototype briefly considered, and that the F-14 Tomcat would later use. But the mechanism added several tons of weight, and the structural complexity of building a swing wing the size of an airliner's was unproven. The Delta was simpler. There's a problem with Delta wings, however. They don't generate lift the way conventional wings do. A Delta wing produces its lift through vortex flow, the leading edge vortex, which only develops at high angles of attack. The aircraft has to be tilted nose up 15, 18, 20 degrees to generate enough lift to fly slowly. This is fine when you're cruising at Mach 2 and the angle of attack is small. It's not fine when you're landing, because at landing speed, the nose of the aircraft is tilted so high that the pilot cannot see the runway. The Concorde solution was the drooping nose. The nose of the Concorde was hinged. It could be tilted downward by 5 degrees for takeoff and by 12.5 degrees for landing. Two independent hydraulic systems drove it, with mechanical interlocks to prevent it from being raised inadvertently at high speed. When the nose was up in cruise position, a transparent visor was raised in front of the cockpit windscreen for aerodynamic and thermal protection. The visor retracted into the fuselage when the nose came down. The whole mechanism was visible from the cabin. Passengers could see the floor of the cockpit through the open visor gap during the descent into Heathrow or JFK. The droop was operated by the captain through a single lever on the center console, with positions for visor down, 5 degrees and 12.5. The actuation took about 10 seconds for each position. The mechanism was over-engineered. It had to be. A failure to droop the nose on landing would have meant the captain landing the aircraft blind. There was another problem with cruising at Mach 2. When an aircraft accelerates from subsonic to supersonic flight, the aerodynamic center of pressure, the point on the wing where the lift force effectively acts, shifts rearward. On the Concorde, that shift was substantial, about 180 centimeters, or 6 feet, rearward, between subsonic cruise and supersonic cruise. If you do nothing about that, the aircraft becomes uncontrollable. The lift is now acting much farther aft than the center of gravity, which means the nose pitches down, and you spend all your control authority fighting that pitch down moment. You lose altitude. You burn fuel fighting the trim. You can't sustain Mach 2 flight. The Concorde solved this by moving the center of gravity of the aircraft rearward in flight to match where the lift had moved. It did this by pumping fuel. Approximately 20 tons of fuel, out of the roughly 95 tons the aircraft carried at takeoff, were pumped from forward tanks to aft tanks during transonic acceleration and pumped back forward again during deceleration before landing. The fuel was a trim mechanism. There were 13 fuel tanks, 4 main wing tanks, 4 collector tanks for the engines, 2 forward trim tanks numbered 9 and 10, and an aft trim tank numbered 11, plus 2 transfer tanks numbered 5 and 7 that connected everything. The transfer process was automated, controlled by the flight engineer. About 5 minutes of fuel pumping during the transonic push, about 5 minutes again during the deceleration. The fuel quantity indicators on the engineer's panel showed the center of gravity continuously, tracked against the allowable corridor for the current speed and altitude. The fuel system on Concorde was unusual in another way as well. The fuel was used as a heat sink. The Olympus 5 and 93 engines at supersonic cruise produced more heat than the engine bay could shed through normal cooling. So the hydraulic fluid, the engine oil, and the avionics cooling air were all run through heat exchangers immersed in the cold fuel. The fuel warmed up. The aircraft's other systems cooled down. As fuel burned off, the remaining fuel got warmer, and the heat rejection capacity dropped. This was why the aircraft's cruise time was limited, not because it ran out of fuel, but because the fuel got too hot to cool anything else. The cabin windows. The passenger windows on the Concorde were 16.5 centimeters tall by 6.5 centimeters wide, 6.5 inches by 2.5 inches, about the size of a paperback book, about the size of the hand of an adult sitting next to you on the flight. This was deliberate. At 60,000 feet, the cabin was pressurized to roughly 6,000 feet of equivalent altitude, which means a differential pressure between inside and outside was about 8 pounds per square inch. A standard airliner window, the kind you'd find on a 747, has roughly 6 pounds per square inch of differential at 35,000 feet. The Concorde was carrying a third more pressure across a much smaller margin of safety because if a window blew out at 60,000 feet, the cabin would empty into the stratosphere in seconds. Smaller windows meant smaller decompression orifices. If a window failed at altitude, the air would leak out more slowly. The crew had time to get oxygen masks on, declare an emergency, and begin a rapid descent to a survivable altitude. With the windows the size they were, the emergency descent was projected to be survivable. With larger windows, the calculation came out very differently. There was a second reason as well. The Concorde fuselage was a slender, highly stressed pressure vessel. Cutouts in a pressure vessel are structural weaknesses. The bigger the cutout, the more reinforcement material you have to add around it, and the heavier the structure becomes. On an aircraft where every kilogram of structure costs you fuel, and fuel costs you range, the smallest windows that the regulators would accept were the windows you wanted. This is why passengers on Concorde looking out at the 60,000-foot view of the Atlantic were looking through a slot the size of their own hand. It is also one of the things people remember most clearly about flying on the aircraft. The windows were tiny, and the view through them was unlike any view they had ever seen. We'll go up there ourselves in a few hours. For now, let's stay on the ground a little longer and look at the engines. There were 4 engines on the Concorde, 2 under each wing in paired nacelles set close to the fuselage. Each engine was a Rolls-Royce Olympus 593 Mark 610, and each engine was, at takeoff with afterburners lit, the most powerful jet engine ever fitted to a commercial airliner. The Olympus engine did not begin its life on the Concorde. The original Olympus, the Bristol Siddeley Olympus, was designed in the early 1950s for the Avro Vulcan strategic bomber. The Vulcan was Britain's delta-winged nuclear deterrent platform, and the Olympus was the engine that put it in the air. It went through generations of revision through the 1950s and 1960s, getting more powerful with each one, until by the late Vulcan B-2 variant, it was producing 20,000 pounds of thrust. That was the engine the Concorde program looked at in 1962 and decided they could build their airliner around, if they could find another 50% of thrust to put on top of it. The work to do that was shared between Bristol Siddeley in the United Kingdom, which by 1966 had merged into Rolls-Royce, and SNECMA in France. SNECMA, Société Nationale d'Études et de Construction de Moteurs d'Aviation, was the French national aero engine maker. Rolls-Royce built the engine's hot section, the compressors, the turbines, the combustors. SNECMA built the afterburner section and the exhaust nozzle. The 2 parts were married together at engine test stands in both countries. The final engine, the Olympus 593 Mark 610, was a twin-spool turbojet, not a turbofan. The high bypass ratios that make modern airliners quiet do not work at supersonic speeds. Concorde was a pure jet aircraft in the way that fighter aircraft of the same era were pure jet aircraft. The engine sucked air in through a complicated intake, compressed it across 2 spools running at different speeds, mixed it with fuel, and ignited it in a combustion chamber, expanded the hot gas through 2 turbine stages, and then exhausted it through a variable geometry nozzle. At takeoff, with the afterburner lit, each engine produced 38,050 pounds of thrust, about 169,000 newtons. With all 4 engines together, the aircraft produced roughly 152,000 pounds of total thrust on the takeoff roll, which was enough to push 170 tons of loaded Concorde down the runway at a takeoff acceleration roughly twice that of a Boeing 747. At supersonic cruise, however, with the afterburners off, each engine produced only about 10,000 pounds of net thrust. That number's surprising if you've never thought about it before. The engines, at the cruise condition the aircraft was designed for, were producing about a quarter of their takeoff power. The aircraft was moving through the air at 2,000 kilometers an hour with engines that, on paper, would not have been enough to take off in. This is because at supersonic cruise, the engines were not doing most of the work. To understand what was doing most of the work, you have to look at the intake. The Olympus 593 was a turbojet, and like every turbojet, its compressor could only ingest air at subsonic speeds. The blades of the first compressor stage spin at roughly the speed of sound at their tips. If you push supersonic air at them directly, you create shock waves that damage the blades, you stall the airflow, and the engine quits. So at Mach 2, the air arriving at the front of the aircraft was moving at roughly 600 meters per second, and the air arriving at the compressor face had to be moving at no more than 150 meters per second. Somewhere between the lip of the intake and the compressor, the air had to be slowed down by a factor of 4, without losing much of its pressure. This is what the variable geometry intake did. Each engine had a rectangular intake about 2.5 meters long, mounted under the wing. Inside the intake, on the upper surface, were 2 hinged metal ramps, a forward ramp and an aft ramp. Both were hydraulically actuated. Both were continuously variable. They didn't have discrete settings. They moved smoothly to whatever angle the intake control system commanded. The angles were scheduled against aircraft Mach number, engine speed, intake pressure ratio, and angle of attack. Below Mach 1.3, the ramp stayed almost flat against the intake roof, and the engine breathed through the open mouth normally. Auxiliary inlets opened in the lower surface of the nacelle to help feed the engine at low speed. Above Mach 1.3, the ramps started to come down into the airstream. This created a series of oblique shock waves at the leading edges of the ramps, 3 of them in a controlled pattern, all converging at the lower lip of the intake. The shock waves stepped the air down in speed, from Mach 2 to roughly Mach 1.6, then to Mach 1.3, then to roughly Mach 1.0. At the lip itself, a final normal shock wave dropped the air to subsonic. By the time the air reached the engine's compressor, it was moving at roughly Mach 0.5. The compressor saw subsonic air. The aircraft was at Mach 2. The difference was managed entirely by the geometry of those 2 ramps. There was also a spill door in the lower surface of the intake that opened automatically if the airflow became too high, dumping the excess air overboard rather than choking the engine. The spill door also prevented engine surge during transonic acceleration and during throttle movements at supersonic speed. Now here is the part that is worth saying slowly. The intake, by slowing down the air, was also compressing it. The air arriving at the compressor was not just slower than the air outside. It was at much higher pressure. The pressure recovery, the ratio of the air pressure at the compressor face to the air pressure outside the aircraft, was roughly 9-to-1 at Mach 2. That high-pressure air, expanding outward as it pushed against the walls of the intake, generated thrust, pure aerodynamic thrust. With no help from the engine itself, the intake walls, the ramps, the sides, the lip, were being pushed forward by the compression of the air against them. This is the same effect that makes a rocket exhaust produce thrust against the inside of its nozzle. It's a pressure imbalance. The inside of the structure has high pressure gas pushing on it. The outside is at ambient pressure, and the net force is forward. At Mach 2 supersonic cruise, that intake thrust accounted for roughly 63% of the total propulsion of the Concorde. The engine itself, the rotating combustion machinery in the middle, produced only about 8%. The exhaust nozzle, the variable geometry convergent-divergent nozzle at the back, which expanded the hot gas as it left the engine and recovered more thrust from it, produced the remaining 29%. The engine, in other words, was less than 1/10 of what was pushing the aircraft. The shape of the inlet and the shape of the outlet were doing the rest. This is the part of Concorde that is most worth pausing on, because it is the part that is most counterintuitive. The thing that made supersonic passenger flight economically possible was not the engine. It was the intake. The afterburner was used in 2 phases of flight and 2 phases only. On the takeoff roll, The afterburners were lit before brake release, and they ran until shortly after the aircraft was airborne and climbing. They provided the additional thrust needed to get 170 tons of loaded aircraft off the runway in roughly 3,000 meters. The second phase was the transonic push. As the aircraft accelerated from subsonic to supersonic, it passed through a band of speeds between about Mach 0.95 and Mach 1.7, where the engines were not yet efficient enough on their own to keep the aircraft accelerating. So the afterburners were relit around Mach 0.95, and they stayed lit until about Mach 1.7, at which point the intakes were doing enough work that the engines could continue the acceleration to Mach 2 on dry thrust alone. That was it. Afterburners on the takeoff. Afterburners on the transonic push. Approximately 12 minutes of afterburner time per Atlantic crossing total. The rest of the flight, more than 3 hours of cruise, was on dry thrust, with the intakes doing most of the work. The fuel burn during afterburner was enormous, about 200% of the dry consumption rate. The fuel burn at supersonic cruise was high by modern standards, but not unreasonable. Roughly 20 tons per hour for the 4 engines together at the design cruise condition. There was one more thing the engine had to deal with. The engine bay at Mach 2 was hot. The compression of the air, the exhaust of the combustion chamber, the heat of the metal of the engine itself. All of these combined to make the engine bay temperature reach values that no normal jet engine had to tolerate. The Concorde engine bay was lined with titanium heat shields. The engine itself had to be cool, internally, even when the air outside the engine was at several hundred degrees Celsius. The cooling was done with fuel, the same fuel that was also the trim mechanism, the same fuel that was the heat sink for the avionics. The fuel flowed through cooling jackets around the engine before being burned. By the time it reached the combustion chamber, the fuel was already warm, sometimes very warm. The Rolls-Royce engineers like to say that the Olympus 593 at supersonic cruise was an engine that ran on fuel that was already half-cooked. We've now spent enough time on the ground. The engine was ready, the airframe was ready, the fuel system was ready, the mock-ups were finished. The first prototype, designated 001, was sitting in a hangar at Toulouse in February 1969, having taxi tests almost every day. It was time to fly the thing. The first prototype of the Concorde was designated 001, and it was built at Sud Aviation's facility in Toulouse. It was painted white, with the French registration FWTSS on its side, and a thin blue, white, and red stripe along the fuselage. The British prototype, 002, was being built simultaneously at Filton, near Bristol, and carried the registration GBSST. The two aircraft were almost identical. The two countries had agreed that the first to be ready to fly would fly first, and that the honor of the maiden flight would go to whichever side had finished the ground test first. It was 001. It was the French aircraft. It was Toulouse. The captain of the first flight was André Turcat. Turcat was 48 years old in 1969, a former French Air Force test pilot and the chief test pilot of Sud Aviation. He had been working on the Concorde program since 1963. He had flown almost every other Sud Aviation aircraft that mattered, including the Caravelle. He was the most senior test pilot in the country, and he had earned the seat. His co-pilot was Jacques Guignard, also a Sud Aviation test pilot. The flight engineer was Michel Rétif, and the test engineer in the rear of the cockpit was Henri Perrier. who would go on to become the chief engineer of the entire Concorde program. The crew of 4 had been preparing for this flight for years. The prototype 001 had been doing taxi tests on the runway at Toulouse since late January 1969. Low-speed taxi at first, then medium-speed taxi, then high-speed taxi with the nose wheel lifted off the ground. The aircraft had not yet flown, but it had been off the ground in spirit several times on the long runway at Toulouse-Blagnac. The first flight was scheduled for early February 1969, but the weather in southern France that winter was unusually wet. Day after day of low cloud and rain. The crew waited. The aircraft sat in the hangar. The journalists, who had been arriving in Toulouse since late January, began to leave again. Hotels emptied, flights were rebooked. By the second week of February, the weather had improved. By February the 28th, the aircraft was ready. The runway was dry. The wind was within limits, and Turcat said that he and his crew were going to fly the next day. March the 2nd, 1969 was a Sunday. Toulouse in early March is cold but not freezing. The air on the runway that morning was about 5 degrees Celsius. The wind was light. The sky was overcast, but the cloud base was high enough that visual flight was possible. The crew arrived at the aircraft at about 10 in the morning. They began their pre-flight checks. There was a chase plane assigned to the flight. A Mirage 3B jet trainer, flown by another Sud Aviation test pilot, was waiting on a parallel taxiway. The Mirage would fly formation with the Concorde for the entire flight, observing the aircraft from outside, photographing it, and being ready to provide radio communication if something on the Concorde failed. The flight plan called for the Concorde to take off, climb to about 10,000 feet, fly a series of slow maneuvers, gentle turns, slight pitch changes, slight roll changes, to verify that the basic handling of the aircraft was as the wind tunnel had predicted. The aircraft would not go fast on its first flight. It would not retract its landing gear. It would fly for less than half an hour. Then it would come back to Toulouse and land. This was a deliberately conservative plan. Concorde was the strangest airliner ever built, and the engineering team had no interest in finding out anything they did not already know on the first flight. They knew the aircraft flew at low speed in the wind tunnel. They were going to fly it at low speed in real air, with the gear down, in good visibility, and see whether everything they had predicted matched what actually happened. The engines were started at 14:38 local time. The taxi to the runway took 12 minutes. The takeoff roll began at 15:38 on runway 33 at Toulouse-Blagnac, with the afterburners lit. The aircraft was light. It had only a small amount of fuel on board, no payload, and the flight test instrumentation was about all the additional weight. It accelerated quickly. The takeoff speed was around 190 knots. The rotation was at 185. The wheels left the runway. The aircraft was airborne. 27 minutes later, it was back on the ground. The flight had been almost completely uneventful. Turcat reported that the controls felt good, that the engines had behaved exactly as predicted, that the rudder pedals were perhaps slightly heavier than expected, that the visibility from the cockpit with the nose drooped to 5 degrees was excellent, and that the aircraft seemed to want to fly. After landing, when he was asked by reporters to summarize, he said in French, "Finally, the big bird flies." The fact that the first flight had been uneventful was the most important fact about it. The aircraft had behaved as predicted. The program continued. The British prototype 002 took its first flight on April 9, 1969, just over a month after the French one. Brian Trubshaw was the captain. The flight was out of Filton, near Bristol, with a destination of RAF Fairford for the rest of the test program. Like the French flight, it was conservative. Like the French flight, it was uneventful. Like the French flight, the aircraft behaved as predicted. The two prototypes, 01 from Toulouse, 02 from Filton, spent the next 2.5 years expanding the flight envelope. Through 1969, the test flight stayed subsonic. The crews learned the aircraft at low speed, at medium speed, at high subsonic Mach numbers. They tested the autopilot. They tested emergency procedures. They tested single-engine performance, gear extension and retraction, flap settings, center of gravity excursions. The first supersonic flight came on October 1st, 1969. Concorde 01, with André Turcat in command, accelerated past Mach 1 for the first time. He held it at Mach 1.05 for a few minutes, then decelerated back to subsonic. The aircraft had passed the sound barrier. The aircraft was now officially supersonic. The first flight to Mach 2, the design cruise speed, came on November 4th, 1970. Again it was 0R1, and again it was Turcat. The aircraft sustained Mach 2 for 53 minutes, the longest supersonic cruise that any commercial airliner prototype had ever performed. In June 1969, while both prototypes were still in subsonic envelope expansion, the Concorde made its public debut at the Paris Air Show at Le Bourget. The aircraft displayed there was 001, flown in from Toulouse by Turcat. The aircraft sat on the Le Bourget tarmac for a week, while the public walked past it and looked at it through the fence. On the same tarmac, 50 meters away, was the Soviet Tupolev Tu-144. The Tu-144 was the Concorde's only competitor, a Soviet supersonic transport, externally similar to the Concorde, although the Tu-144 had a more conventional delta wing without the ogival curve and slightly different engine placement. The Tu-144 had taken its first flight on the last day of 1968, more than 2 months before the Concorde's first flight. It was therefore technically the first supersonic airliner ever to fly. The visiting Soviet delegation and the Anglo-French team were cordial. The two aircraft sat in the sun and looked at each other. The British press called the Tu-144 the Concordski, which was unkind and untrue. The two aircraft had been developed in parallel, with no sharing of information between them. The similarities of the shape were because they were both delta-winged supersonic airliners, and there was only one good shape for a delta-winged supersonic airliner. The differences in detail reflected different engineering philosophies. The Tu-144 used a different intake design. It used afterburners during cruise, which the Concorde would never do. It had a much shorter range. Its passenger cabin was a different layout. The two aircraft were cousins, not twins. The Tu-144's history would not be a happy one. At the 1973 Paris Air Show, a Tu-144 broke up in flight while performing a low-altitude demonstration. The accident killed the crew of 6 and 8 people on the ground. The investigation never fully explained what had happened. The Soviet program continued for another 5 years, but the Tu-144 never flew sustained commercial passenger service in the way Concorde would. It made a few cargo flights for Aeroflot, and then it was quietly retired. The Concorde by 1971 was now flying daily, and its envelope was almost fully expanded. The aircraft was approaching certification. The flight engineers panel on the Concorde was a wall of dials and switches that ran nearly from the floor to the cockpit ceiling. Fuel, hydraulics, electrical, pressurization, air conditioning, intake control, engine performance, all monitored continuously all the responsibility of one person. The flight engineers who trained on the Concorde came from the older generation of long-haul flying, where the engineer was the third member of the cockpit crew. By the time Concorde retired in 2003, the rest of the airline world had moved on to two-pilot cockpits with computerized engine management. The Concorde flight engineer was the last of his kind on a commercial airline. Some of the men who flew the Concorde in the 1990s had been flying jet airliners since the late 1950s. There is a story from this period about the cockpit. At some point during the test flights, when 001 had been pushed to its maximum sustained cruise temperature, one of the flight engineers wedged his uniform cap into the gap that had opened beside his electrical panel as the aircraft stretched. The fuselage at Mach 2 elongated by about 25 centimeters, about 10 inches, and the gap appeared roughly an inch or two wide at the back of the cockpit. When the aircraft slowed down and cooled, the fuselage shrank back, and the gap closed, and the cap was permanently trapped. The cap stayed there for the life of the aircraft. The story spread. The flight engineers on the production aircraft, years later, would do the same thing on retirement flights, leaving their hats in the gaps for the museum aircraft to preserve. If you visit certain Concordes today in their final museum positions, you can still see the hats. The two prototypes, 011 and 002, were research aircraft. They were never intended to carry passengers. The aircraft that would actually fly the revenue service was the production standard Concorde, and the first of those was 201, which first flew at Toulouse on December the 6th, 1973. Production standard Concorde was longer than the prototype by about 1.5 meters. It had a slightly different wing shape with sharper leading edges. It had production avionics, production cabin fittings, production windows and doors. It had the Olympus 593 Mark 610 engines, not the lower thrust prototype engines. It looked from the outside almost identical to 001. It flew from the inside like a real airliner. 16 production aircraft were built in total between 1973 and 1979. 14 of them entered commercial service. The other two, 101 and 102, the first two production aircraft, were retained by the manufacturers for additional testing and never carried passengers. Type certification was granted by the French authorities in December 1975 and by the British authorities in January 1976. By that point, however, a different and larger problem had been quietly accumulating around the program for nearly a decade. It had nothing to do with the engineering. The engineering worked. The aircraft flew at Mach 204. The certification flights all passed. The problem was that the aircraft, when it flew at Mach 2, made a noise on the ground that no one had quite prepared for. A sonic boom is what happens when an aircraft moves through the air faster than the air can get out of its way. The pressure waves that the aircraft generates, which at subsonic speeds spread out evenly in all directions, instead pile up into two shock waves, one from the nose and one from the tail. The pair of shock waves trails behind the aircraft in the shape of a long cone. When that cone passes over the ground, the people underneath it hear it as a sharp double crack, like two very loud rifle shots in quick succession, separated by a fraction of a second. The exact loudness depends on the size and shape of the aircraft and on the altitude at which it is flying. A fighter aircraft producing a sonic boom over a residential area at low altitude can break windows. A Concorde at 60,000 feet, producing a boom over the same area, will not break windows, but it will rattle them. The boom, measured in pressure units, would arrive at the ground at about 1 to 2 pounds per square foot, or roughly 1,000th of an atmosphere. The duration was about 300 milliseconds. The double crack would be unmistakable, and it would be loud enough to startle anyone who heard it without warning. The American Supersonic Transport Program, which was running in parallel with the Concorde program through the 1960s, had run a famous experiment in 1964 over Oklahoma City. For 6 months, the United States Air Force flew Convair B-58 Hustler bombers at supersonic speeds over the city, 8 times a day, every day. The intent was to measure how citizens responded to repeated sonic booms in a real-world setting over a real population. The intent was, more honestly, to demonstrate that the public could be acclimated to supersonic overflights so that the American SST could be approved for transcontinental operations. The experiment did not go as planned. Over 6 months, the people of Oklahoma City filed approximately 15,000 complaints about the booms. Damage claims were filed for 9,490 items, mostly broken windows and cracked plaster. Public approval of the program dropped from 60% at the beginning of the test to 25% at the end. Lawsuits followed. The Air Force eventually paid out a small amount to a small number of claimants. The data from the experiment was used by both sides of the supersonic argument for the next decade. The American Federal Aviation Administration concluded in 1973 that supersonic flight by civilian aircraft over the United States would not be permitted. The rule was written as 14 CFR Part 91-817, and it remains on the books today. No civilian aircraft may fly faster than the speed of sound over any part of the continental United States, except in specifically authorized military and research airspace. The political environment in the United States in the early 1970s was not friendly to the Concorde either. The American SST program, Boeing's Swing Wing 2707, designed to be larger and faster than the Concorde, was canceled by Congress in March 1971. The cancellation was a defeat for the American aerospace industry and an embarrassment for the Nixon administration. It also created a specific political incentive in the United States to make sure that the British and French, who had now spent 10 years and $1 billion building their own SST, would not be allowed to operate it profitably in American airspace. Citizens groups formed to oppose Concorde service to American airports. The Sierra Club opposed Concorde on environmental grounds. The Coalition Against Concorde was formed in New York in 1976 specifically to keep the aircraft out of John F. Kennedy International Airport. Their stated objection was noise. Concorde, on takeoff, produced approximately 119 decibels at the airport boundary, compared to about 103 decibels for a Boeing 747 of the same era. The Concorde was, by the takeoff noise metric, the loudest commercial airliner ever certified. The unstated objection from many quarters was that the Anglo-French program had succeeded where the American program had failed. And there were people in the United States who would have preferred that this not be celebrated daily by Concorde landings at Kennedy. The legal fight over JFK lasted nearly 2 years. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which operated the airport, voted in March 1976 to prohibit Concorde operations from JFK. British Airways and Air France took the Port Authority to court. The case went through several appeals, eventually reaching the United States Supreme Court, which declined to hear it. A federal court ruled in 1977 that the Port Authority could not unilaterally ban a single aircraft type that the federal aviation authorities had certified for service. The Port Authority appealed. They lost again. In October 1977, after a final round of legal procedure, the Port Authority dropped its objection. The first Concorde landed at JFK on November the 22nd, 1977. There were demonstrators with signs at the airport perimeter. There were people who lived in the towns near the airport who came out to watch the aircraft arrive. The double crack of the sonic boom was not heard because the Concorde, on its approach to JFK, was flying subsonically. It was only over the ocean, after takeoff or before approach, that the aircraft went supersonic. This was the compromise that would define the Concorde's commercial life. The aircraft could not fly supersonically over land. Not in the United States, not in most of Europe, not over any country whose government took a position on it. The boom was a real problem, and no amount of diplomacy could make a boom inaudible. So the routes were structured around the ocean. London to New York. The aircraft accelerated to supersonic speed off the southwest coast of Ireland, cruised at Mach 2 across the Atlantic, decelerated to subsonic before reaching the American coast near Long Island, and made a subsonic approach into JFK. Paris to Rio, supersonic over the Atlantic, with a refueling stop at Dakar. London to Bahrain, subsonic over Europe, supersonic over the Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula. Other routes were tried. London to Tokyo, London to Singapore. They were unprofitable. They involved long subsonic segments because the routes crossed land, and the subsonic segments wiped out most of the time savings. London to Tokyo, supersonic where possible, took 11 hours and was 3 hours faster than a 747. 3 hours saved on a 50,000-pound ticket is real, but is not transformative. Subsonic over India is just flying. The aircraft was, in the end, only profitable on the Atlantic. There was a second, deeper problem with the program by the mid-1970s, and it had to do with the maintenance of the aircraft itself. The Concorde was made of RR58 aluminum alloy, which we mentioned earlier. RR58 was not a standard aviation alloy. It was not produced in the same volumes as 7075 or 2024, the alloys that the rest of the airliner industry used. Replacement panels for the Concorde had to be made to order by Rolls-Royce in small batches. The cost per panel was substantially higher than for a comparable 747 panel. The kinetic heating cycle was also harder on the structure than on a normal airliner. Every supersonic cruise was a thermal load on the aluminum. The structure heated up, expanded, cooled down, contracted repeatedly over thousands of cycles. Engineers tracked the fatigue budget of each airframe. The certification limit was set conservatively on the basis of test articles flown to destruction at Filton. The aircraft was approved for 45,000 reference flights, where one reference flight was one transatlantic supersonic crossing. This was a generous limit. By 2003, even the highest time Concorde in the fleet had only flown about 23,000 reference flights. Fatigue was not what retired the aircraft. The fuel was also unusual. The Concorde used a special grade of Jet A1 with a higher concentration of anti-static additive than standard airliners required, because the fuel was being pumped at higher rates through more components. And static electricity buildup was a real ignition concern. The fuel was procured separately from the regular jet fuel supply at each airport. By 2003, only Heathrow, Charles de Gaulle, JFK, Barbados, and a handful of other airports stocked it routinely. Diversions to other airports required special arrangements. These maintenance facts did not make the Concorde uneconomical on their own. The aircraft was profitable for British Airways, in particular, from the mid-1980s onward. But they were always part of the conversation. The cost per flight hour to operate a Concorde was multiples higher than the cost per flight hour to operate a 747. The premium pricing of the ticket, around $3,000 one way in 1980 and rising to around $8,000 by 2000, was what closed the gap. The aircraft made financial sense because of the people who would pay $8,000 to be in New York that afternoon instead of that evening. We're going to meet some of those people in a few minutes, but before we do, the inaugural flight, January 21st, 1976, both sides simultaneously, both inaugurals at the same hour. The inaugural commercial flights of the Concorde were synchronized. January the 21st, 1976, a Wednesday, both flights departed at exactly 11:40 in the morning local time on either side of the channel. From London Heathrow, a British Airways Concorde, registration GBOAA, lifted off for Bahrain. From Paris Charles de Gaulle, an Air France Concorde, registration FBVFA, lifted off for Rio de Janeiro via Dakar. Both aircraft were full. Both flights had been sold for months. The passengers were a careful mix of dignitaries, business travelers, and journalists, with a handful of paying customers who had bought tickets the same way anyone buys an airline ticket. The British flight took 3 hours and 38 minutes to reach Bahrain. The subsonic 707 of the same era took 6.5 hours. The French flight took 7 hours, with the refueling stop at Dakar included. The same flight on a 747 took 14. The Concorde was, on its first day of revenue service, doing exactly what the program had set out to make it do. It was having the time of long flights. The aircraft worked. The original route map was broader than what the Concorde would eventually settle into. British Airways flew Concorde to Bahrain initially, then extended the route to Singapore in late 1977 in a code share with Singapore Airlines. The Singapore route was a curiosity. The aircraft was painted with Singapore Airlines livery on one side and British Airways on the other, and operated under both flight numbers. The code share lasted 3 years before the Singapore service was discontinued in 1980 for reasons that came down to overflight restrictions over Malaysia and India. Air France flew to Rio, to Caracas, and to Washington Dulles in the early years. Most of these routes were discontinued by the mid-1980s. The aircraft simply could not generate enough revenue on routes that required long subsonic segments or that did not have a sufficient premium business traffic market. By 1980, both airlines had concentrated their Concorde fleets on the Atlantic. British Airways flew London Heathrow to New York JFK and London to Washington Dulles, and occasionally to Miami and Toronto. Air France flew Paris CDG to New York JFK with periodic services to Washington and to Mexico City. The Atlantic was where the aircraft made sense. The Atlantic had the premium business travel market that supported the tickets. The Atlantic was the ocean over which the aircraft could fly supersonically. The economics of the Concorde in the first decade of service were poor. British Airways in particular was losing money on every flight in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The reason was political. The British government, which had funded the program, was selling the aircraft to British Airways at a price that reflected what the government wanted the airline's books to look like, not what the aircraft had cost to build. The pricing was complicated further by the fact that British Airways was at that point still a state-owned airline, and the Treasury was on both sides of the transaction. The result in 1979 and 1980 was that the Concorde operation at British Airways was running at a loss of about £10 million a year. This changed in 1983. Lord King, The new chairman of British Airways hired a consulting firm to look at the Concorde operation and to figure out why it was losing money. The consulting firm did a market survey. They asked Concorde passengers what they thought they had paid for their tickets. The passengers, who were almost entirely paying through corporate expense accounts and did not look at the prices closely, gave estimates that were on average $3,000 higher than the actual fare. The consultants reported this to British Airways. British Airways raised the fare by an average of $3,000 per ticket. The passengers did not notice. The load factor did not drop. The aircraft became profitable almost overnight, simply by charging what the passengers had assumed they were already paying. From 1983 to the late 1990s, British Airways' Concorde operation ran at an operating profit. The exact margins were never published, but the airline's annual reports indicated that the Concorde fleet contributed somewhere between 30 and 50 million pounds of operating profit per year through the mid-1990s. On 12 aircraft, 220,000 revenue passengers per year. The math worked out. Air France's Concorde operation never reached the same margins. The French route structure was different. The premium business market on the Paris-New York route was smaller than the London-New York market. Air France had fewer flights and lower load factors. The Concorde operation at Air France was a prestige operation, financed by the profitability of the rest of the airline. Some Air France executives, in private, would later say that the Concorde had cost the company money every year of its service life. Other Air France executives would dispute that. The accounting was, perhaps, less important to Air France than the fact that the aircraft existed and that France had built it. The ticket prices, by the late 1990s, had reached the level where Concorde flying was unambiguously a luxury good. A return trip from London to New York on Concorde in 1999 cost approximately $8,500. The same trip on a subsonic 747 in business class cost about $3,500. The Concorde fare was roughly 2.5 times the business class fare for a flight that was 3.5 hours shorter. The passenger demographic that supported this pricing was specific. Roughly 70% of Concorde passengers were business travelers. Investment bankers, traders, senior corporate executives, lawyers on deal teams, consultants on transatlantic engagements. Concorde was the aircraft you took when an extra 4 hours on the same day was worth more than the fare differential. You could leave London at 10 in the morning and be in a meeting in Manhattan at 9:30 in the morning, local time. You could fly to a New York meeting in the morning and return to London for dinner. Time zones were no longer a constraint on the same-day Atlantic round trip. The other 30% of passengers were a mixed group: wealthy leisure travelers, honeymooning couples who had been given the trip as a gift, aviation enthusiasts who had saved for years to take a single flight, rock stars and actors and athletes who could afford it without thinking about it. There are stories of the Rolling Stones taking Concorde on the way to American tour dates in the 1990s, of Mick Jagger sitting in row 5 and asking the flight attendant for a glass of water. The aircraft attracted the kind of people who could appear in many other expensive places, but who came to Concorde anyway because Concorde was specific. The cabin itself was understated. The interior had been refurbished several times over the aircraft's service life, most recently in 1995 for British Airways and in 1992 for Air France. And the latest refit by Sir Terence Conran's firm had given the cabin a soft beige and gray palette with leather seats arranged 2 by 2 on either side of the aisle. There was no first-class divider on the Concorde. The whole cabin was first class. 100 passenger seats with the same legroom, the same service, the same meal for every passenger. The aircraft was not big enough to support multiple service classes, and the passenger mix was not different enough to need them. The seat pitch was 38 inches, which is generous but not extravagant. The seats reclined modestly. The aircraft was not a sleeping flight. 3.5 hours from London to New York is not enough time to sleep. The Concorde was a flight where you ate, drank, worked or read, and arrived. The meal service was the closest thing the airline had to ceremony. On a daytime flight, lunch began about 30 minutes after takeoff, with canapes and Krug champagne. The starter was usually lobster or caviar. The main course was offered in 3 options, with a fish, a meat, and a vegetarian choice. There was a dessert, a cheese course, coffee, and a digestive. The meal was served on white china. The flatware was silver. The flight attendants, 3 of them in the BA cabin, worked the aisles for the entire flight. There were stories about specific dishes. The lobster, in particular, became a cultural artifact. There were passengers who flew the Concorde specifically for the lobster. There were food writers who reviewed the Concorde service the way they reviewed restaurants. There was a brief period in the late 1990s when the British Airways Concorde menu was considered, by people who paid attention to such things, to be one of the better food experiences in commercial aviation. The Krug, by the way, was Krug Grand Cuvée. The Concorde service used enough of it every year that the airline became a significant customer of the house in Reims, and the menu specified the cuvée by name. The flight crew, the people who actually flew the aircraft, were a small group. By 2003, there were perhaps 200 pilots in the world who had ever been current on the Concorde. Roughly half of them flew for British Airways. Roughly half flew for Air France. A few had been test pilots at Sud Aviation or BAC. The qualification took 6 months of training, mostly in the simulators at Filton and Toulouse. Pilots tended to fly the aircraft for the last decade of their careers, having earned the seat through long subsonic time on 747s and 767s and TriStars. The crew assignments were prestigious. There were British Airways captains who, when offered a check ride on the 747-400 with an attendant pay increase, declined the move because they did not want to leave Concorde. There were pilots who flew the aircraft for 15 years and would describe in retirement the specific feeling of the aircraft accelerating through Mach 1, the small tremor in the seatbelt buckle as the reheat came on, the way the engines breathed. The flight engineers were the 3rd member of the cockpit crew. They managed the fuel system, the intake control, the electrical and hydraulic and pressurization systems. Their panel ran nearly the full height of the cockpit behind the pilot's seats. By the late 1990s, the flight engineer was a position that no longer existed on any other commercial aircraft. The 747-400 had eliminated the seat in the early 1990s. The 777, which entered service in 1995, had never had one. The Concorde's flight engineers were the last of their profession. The ground crews were also specialized. Concorde required ground support equipment that no other airliner used. The intake ramps had to be calibrated. The fuel system, with its 13 tanks and complex trim logic, required particular handling. The aircraft could not share maintenance bays with other airliners. The heat shielding inside the engine nacelles needed regular replacement, and the inspection procedures were unique to the aircraft. British Airways maintained a dedicated Concorde hangar at Heathrow. Air France maintained a similar facility at Charles de Gaulle. The technicians who worked on these aircraft, like the pilots and the engineers, were specialists who would spend decades on the same airframes. Now let's get inside one of these flights. Let's go up to 60,000 feet. The aircraft you are flying on today is a British Airways Concorde service from London Heathrow to John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The captain is a senior British Airways Concorde pilot with 2.5 decades of jet experience behind him. The flight engineer has been in the right rear seat of various airliners since the late 1970s. There are 98 passengers in the cabin this afternoon, with seats available for 2 more. You arrived at Terminal 4 at Heathrow about an hour before the flight. Concorde used Terminal 4 for its entire London operation, and the check-in desks for the Concorde service were arranged separately from the rest of the airline. There was a small lounge, the Concorde Room, that was reserved for Concorde passengers on the upper level of the terminal, with views over the apron. The lounge served champagne and breakfast and small dishes through the morning, depending on the service. The boarding call came at 10:25 in the morning for an 11 o'clock departure. You walked from the lounge down a dedicated jetway. The jetway was narrow because the Concorde's passenger door was narrow. Everything about the aircraft, from the inside as much as from the outside, gave a sense of compactness. The fuselage at its widest was only 2 meters and 70 centimeters across, narrower than a 737. The aisle was narrow. The seats were narrow. The aircraft was a fast aircraft, and fast aircraft are thin. You found your seat. The seat number was 8A on the left side of the cabin, 2 rows behind the forward galley. The seat was leather in a soft gray, with a small folding tray table in the armrest. The window beside you was the size of your hand. The wall around the window had been painted a slightly warmer shade than the rest of the cabin, as though the design team had decided to acknowledge that the windows deserved a frame. There was a small Mach meter mounted on the bulkhead ahead of the front row of seats, visible to all passengers, currently showing 0. The captain came on the intercom at 10:55. He welcomed everyone aboard. He noted that the flight time today would be 3 hours and 32 minutes, gate to gate. He said that the air traffic situation was good and that they did not anticipate any delays. He said that the meal service would begin shortly after takeoff and that the cabin crew would make sure everyone had what they needed. His voice was relaxed. He had flown this route, on this aircraft, thousands of times. The aircraft pushed back at 10:58. The engines were started, 2 at a time, on the tow as it left the gate. By the time the tow disconnected the aircraft, all 4 Olympus 593s were idling. The taxi to runway 27L took about 12 minutes. You watched through your hand-sized window the line of more conventional airliners parked at the surrounding gates, each one with their 30 or 40 meter wings, their high bypass turbofans hung from pylons. The Concorde you were sitting on was a different species. At 11:10, you were lined up on runway 27L. The captain announced takeoff thrust. There was a deep building noise from behind, low and heavy, that rose through the cabin and seemed to come from the floor as much as from the engines. Then the afterburners lit. The noise rose suddenly as though 4 very large additional engines had appeared somewhere outside the aircraft. The seat pushed against your back. The aircraft began to move, and then it accelerated in a way that was unlike any commercial aircraft you had ever taken off in. You watched the runway markings go past the window in a blur. The acceleration kept going. The nose came up. The wheels left the runway at about 190 knots. The afterburners stayed lit for another 15 seconds until the aircraft was at 250 knots and climbing. Then the captain throttled them back. The sudden drop in noise was its own event. You climbed out over the western suburbs of London at subsonic speed, following the standard departure procedure. The cabin pressurization came up to its equivalent of 6,000 feet. The Mach meter on the bulkhead read about 0.6. The captain announced that the meal service would begin shortly. The cabin crew, 3 of them, started up the aisle with the trolleys. By 11:40, you had crossed the western coast of Ireland and were over the open Atlantic. The captain came back on the intercom. He said that in approximately 1 minute, they would be making the supersonic acceleration. He said the afterburners would relight and that passengers would feel a slight push back into their seats for about 90 seconds, and that after that, the ride would smooth out and you would be at cruise. The reheat light came on. The noise from the engines rose again in the same heavy building way that it had risen on takeoff, although less violently this time, because the airframe was no longer fighting gravity in the same way. You felt the push back. The seatbelt buckle tightened against your hip. The Mach meter on the bulkhead, which had been holding at 0.95, started to climb. 0.97, 0.99, through 1 point with no particular sensation, because the crossing of the sound barrier inside the aircraft is mathematically significant, but physically unremarkable. 1.05, 1.20, 1.40, the afterburners stayed lit until 1.70. Then the captain throttled them back, and the engines settled into dry cruise. The aircraft continued to accelerate, more gently now, on the intake and nozzle thrust we discussed earlier. 180, 190. By the time you had finished your first glass of Krug, the Mach meter on the bulkhead read 2.00, and the aircraft was at 54,000 feet, still climbing. Cruise altitude was 60,000 feet, but the aircraft did not stay exactly there. The Concorde used a cruise climb profile. As the fuel burned off, the aircraft got lighter, and as the aircraft got lighter, it could climb a little higher to find air thin enough that the drag was acceptable. So the altitude rose slowly through the flight, from 54,000 at the start of cruise to 56,000 an hour in, to nearly 60,000 by the time the descent began. At those altitudes, you can see the curvature of the Earth. The sky above 60,000 feet is not blue. It's a darker color than blue. It's the color of a piece of dark blue glass, or of water in a swimming pool at night. The lower atmosphere is below you, with its weather and its clouds and its distinct edge along the horizon. Above that, the sky deepens. At 60,000 feet, more than 70% of the atmosphere is below you, and the remaining 30% is thin enough that the sky has started to lose its color. By the time you reach the apex of the Concorde's cruise climb, the sky is almost violet. You looked at it through a window the size of your hand. Outside, the true air temperature was about minus 56 degrees Celsius. The window beside you was warm to the touch. This is the kinetic heating we mentioned earlier. The skin of the aircraft at Mach 2 was at 127 degrees Celsius on the nose and around 90 along the fuselage. The cabin windows were a layered structure, an outer pane of glass that took the heat, an air gap with a desiccant, an inner pane of acrylic, and a second air gap before the cabin pressure boundary. The outer pane got hot. The heat conducted slowly through the air gap and warmed the inner pane. By the time you put your hand on the window, an hour into the cruise, the glass was about 30 degrees Celsius, warm, roughly the temperature of human skin. Outside the 30-degree glass was air 110 degrees colder. The aircraft's insulation was doing its job in the cabin walls, but the windows were small enough that they couldn't insulate the same way. People remember the warm windows. They are one of the things former Concorde passengers describe most often when asked what was different about the experience. The window was warm in your hand. The aircraft itself had stretched. We mentioned this in passing. At Mach 2 cruise, the fuselage had elongated by about 25 centimeters from its ground-cold length. The metal had expanded with the heat. The expansion was distributed along the length of the aircraft, but it was most visible in the cockpit, where a small gap had opened beside the flight engineer's electrical panel. The gap was about 1.5 centimeters wide. It would close again on the descent. By the time you were back on the ground, the aircraft would be its normal length, and the gap would be invisible. The flight engineer in his seat behind the pilots was watching this all happen continuously. His panel showed the airframe temperature in several locations along the fuselage. It showed the fuel quantities, which were still adjusting as the aircraft continued to burn fuel from the trim tanks. It showed the intake ramp positions, which had moved to their cruise configuration about 40 minutes ago. It showed the engine inlet pressure ratio, the engine exhaust temperature, the engine oil temperature, the bleed air temperature, the cabin pressure rate, the hydraulic pressure on the two main systems. He had a checklist for the cruise phase, and he ran through it every 20 minutes. The lunch service was finished by 12:30 GMT, which was about an hour and 20 minutes after the start of the flight, and the cabin attendants brought coffee and cognac. The cabin lights were dimmed slightly. The Mach meter showed 2.02. The altitude readout showed 57,400 feet. The window beside you was still warm. The two passengers in the row behind you were having a quiet conversation about a meeting they were both attending in Manhattan that evening. The man in the row across the aisle was reading a copy of the Financial Times. The woman in front of you was asleep. It is harder to fall asleep on Concorde than on a normal airline. The flight is short, the light is bright, the cabin is small, the seats recline only modestly, but it can be done. Some passengers did sleep on Concorde. The aircraft did not stay at cruise long enough to matter. By 1:30 GMT, the aircraft was beginning its descent. The deceleration on Concorde was a long, slow event. The aircraft began its descent about 200 nautical miles east of the American coast, or about 35 minutes before landing. The captain reduced thrust. The engines spooled back from their cruise setting. The aircraft began to slow through Mach 1.8, Mach 1.6, Mach 1.4. The fuel was being pumped forward again, from the aft tanks back to the forward ones, to shift the center of gravity for the subsonic flight regime. The seatbelt buckle pressed slightly forward against your hip, the opposite direction from the supersonic acceleration. You drank the last of your coffee. The aircraft passed through Mach 1.0 about 120 nautical miles east of Long Island. There was no sensation. The Mach meter clicked down through the figure. The aircraft was now subsonic. The boom, the long cone of compressed air that had been trailing behind the aircraft for the entire ocean crossing, was now somewhere behind, dissipating in the upper atmosphere, never having reached land. You descended into JFK on a standard approach. The captain dropped the nose to 12.5 degrees on short final. The visor came down in front of the cockpit. The pilots could now see the runway clearly. You landed on runway 22L at JFK at 9:32 in the morning, local time. You had left London at 11:00 GMT. The flight, gate to gate, had been 3 hours and 32 minutes. Local time, you had arrived an hour and a half before you had departed. You had been to lunch and back and crossed an ocean in less time than it takes most people to drive across a small country. You walked off the aircraft down the jetway into Terminal 4 at JFK. The aircraft was already being prepped for its return flight, which would leave at 13:30 local time. The same airframe would be back in London for dinner. This is what the Concorde was for. This is what it did, twice a day for 27 years, until one afternoon in Paris, on a runway in 2000, when something happened that would change all of it. We're going to talk about an accident now. It happened on July the 25th, 2000, on a runway in Paris. The aircraft was an Air France Concorde, registration FBTSC. The flight was a charter for a German tour operator. The passengers were 100 German tourists who had paid to be flown to New York to board a cruise ship. There were 9 crew on board. There were 4 people on the ground who were also killed. All but one of the people on the aircraft died on impact. The official investigation report, published by the French Bureau d'Enquête et d'Analyse in January 2002, is 176 pages long. It is publicly available. It is the source for everything I'm about to say. If you want to know what happened on that runway, the BEA report is where to look. We will summarize. FBTSC was the third Concorde airframe built for Air France. By 2000, the aircraft was 26 years old. It had flown approximately 11,700 reference flights, well within its certified life. Its last major maintenance check had been completed in April 2000. It was on the morning of July 25th, an aircraft in normal certified condition. The flight was Air France 4590, scheduled to depart Charles de Gaulle at 16:30 local time for John F. Kennedy International Airport, New York. The passengers had boarded a chartered cruise ship in New York, the MS Deutschland, and the cruise was to depart that evening. The aircraft was at maximum takeoff weight, 185 tons. The flight had been delayed slightly for a small mechanical issue. A thrust reverser bracket had needed replacement, and the crew had taken on additional fuel to allow for the delay. The crew on the flight deck were Captain Christian Marty, First Officer Jean Marceau, and Flight Engineer Gilles Jardinot. All 3 were experienced on the aircraft. 5 minutes before the Concorde began its takeoff roll, a Continental Airlines DC-10, on its own takeoff roll a few minutes earlier from the same runway, had dropped a small piece of titanium onto the runway surface. The titanium piece was 43 centimeters long and just under 2 centimeters wide. It was a wear strip from the cowl of one of the DC-10's engines. The strip had been replaced incorrectly during maintenance at Continental's facility in Houston 9 days earlier, and it had detached during the DC-10's takeoff. It was lying on the runway, roughly at the midpoint of the runway length. The runway was not inspected between the DC-10's departure and the Concorde's. There was no requirement for it to be inspected. Foreign object debris inspections at Charles de Gaulle in 2000 were scheduled 4 times a day, and the schedule did not call for an inspection in the gap between those 2 takeoffs. The Concorde began its takeoff roll on runway 26, right at 16:42 local time, at approximately the midpoint of the runway, with the aircraft accelerating through approximately 175 knots of ground speed. The left main landing gear of the Concorde rolled over the titanium strip. The strip cut into the number 2 tire on the left main gear. The tire burst. The burst sent a large piece of the tire about 4.5 kilograms, into the underside of the left wing at approximately 140 meters per second. The piece struck the wing on the underside, at the location of the number 5 fuel tank. The strike did not penetrate the tank, but the impact created a hydrodynamic pressure surge inside the tank. The fuel inside the tank, which was incompressible, transmitted the pressure surge through itself, and the surge ruptured the tank from the inside near the impact point. This is one of the unusual mechanisms of failure for a fuel tank. The tank does not fail because it is punctured from outside. It fails because a sudden impact creates a pressure wave inside the fuel itself that exceeds the structural strength of the tank wall. The result is the same: fuel begins to leak. But the cause is not what most people would predict. A large amount of fuel began to leak from the underside of the left wing. The fuel was streaming behind the aircraft in the runway airstream and was ignited almost immediately. The ignition source has been the subject of considerable analysis. The BEA report identifies 2 probable mechanisms: an electric arc in the landing gear wiring, which had been damaged by the tire debris, and direct contact between the fuel and the hot engine exhaust of engines 1 and 2, which were running at full afterburner thrust. Either way, by the time the aircraft was at takeoff speed, there was a large fire trailing behind the left wing. The fire was visible from outside the aircraft. A photograph was taken by a passing motorist on the highway near the airport that shows the Concorde in the takeoff climb with a 30-meter trail of fire behind the left wing. The photograph would later become one of the most widely reproduced images of an aviation accident. The fire was also visible from the tower at Charles de Gaulle. The tower controller informed the crew of the fire. The crew acknowledged. At that moment, the aircraft was at about 200 knots, near the end of the runway. The captain made the decision to continue the takeoff. This decision has been examined in considerable detail by the investigation. The aircraft was past V1, the speed beyond which rejecting the takeoff is prohibited by procedure. The aircraft was also above the speed at which it could have stopped on the remaining runway. The captain's options at that moment were to continue and to attempt to bring the aircraft back around to a landing at Charles de Gaulle or at Le Bourget, which was the nearest airport with a long enough runway. He selected to continue. The aircraft rotated. The wheels left the runway. The fire continued to burn. The aircraft did not climb the way it should have. Within seconds of the rotation, the heat from the fire had reached engines 1 and 2. The engines, which were ingesting hot gases and debris from the burning fuel, started to surge. The number 2 engine gave a fire warning on the engineer's panel. The crew shut down the number 2 engine and discharged its fire bottle. The fire warning went away, but the aircraft was now on 3 engines, with a damaged wing, with continuing fuel loss, with the gear unable to retract because of damaged hydraulic lines. The aircraft climbed to about 250 feet above ground level. It did not climb any higher. It could not. The engine power was not sufficient. The drag from the extended landing gear was too high. The damaged wing was generating less lift than the right wing. The aircraft was now in a low-altitude, low-speed regime that had not been tested or certified for the Concorde. The aircraft drifted left in the direction of the damaged engine. The crew fought the asymmetry with rudder. The aircraft continued to drift. It crossed the airport boundary heading roughly northwest into the area around the village of Gonesse. The aircraft impacted the Hotelissimo Hotel in Gonesse At approximately 16:45 and 3 seconds local time, 2 minutes after it had begun its takeoff roll, there were 4 people in the hotel who were killed. There were 109 people on the aircraft who were killed. 1 survivor on the ground was injured. The grounding came 2 weeks later. On August 15, 2000, the British Civil Aviation Authority and the French Direction Générale de l'Aviation Civile jointly revoked the type certificate of the Concorde. The aircraft could no longer carry paying passengers. The fleet, both British and French, was grounded. The investigation into the accident took 18 months. The BEA report was published in January 2002. The recommendations were extensive. The aircraft, if it was to return to service, would need modifications. The modifications were performed during the grounding. The fuel tanks were lined with Kevlar, flexible armor that would resist a hydrodynamic pressure surge from the inside. New tires were developed jointly with Michelin, with a different cord construction that would resist the kind of impact that the titanium strip had caused. The landing gear wiring was rerouted and shielded. The aircraft's electrical distribution was modified to reduce the probability of an arc near a ruptured tank. The modifications cost approximately £50 million in total across both fleets. British Airways paid for the changes to their aircraft. Air France paid for theirs. The total fleet, 7 British aircraft and 5 French aircraft at this point, was modified over the course of about 18 months. The aircraft was returned to service in November 2001. The first post-modification commercial flight was a British Airways service from Heathrow to JFK on November the 7th. But the world had changed in the 15 months since the accident in ways that had nothing to do with the Concorde and everything to do with the Concorde's economics. The attacks on the World Trade Center in New York on September the 11th, 2001, had been less than 2 months before the Concorde returned to service. The premium business travel market on the transatlantic route had collapsed. The investment bankers and traders and corporate executives who had been the Concorde's core customers were no longer flying in the same numbers. Some of them had died on September 11th. Many of the firms that had been buying Concorde tickets in volume were laying off staff, restricting travel budgets, canceling expansions. The market for an $8,000 one-way ticket to New York, which had been thin even at the peak, was now substantially thinner. The load factor on the Concorde fleet, which had averaged about 70% before the grounding, fell after the return to service. The aircraft, which had been profitable for British Airways through the 1990s, was now losing money on every flight. The same was true for Air France, where the operation had been marginal even in good years. There was also a parts problem. Rolls-Royce had announced during the grounding that they would no longer be producing certain replacement components for the Olympus 593. The engines were old. The components that wore out, turbine blades, certain bearings, specific fuel pump parts, were no longer being made. The existing inventory was finite, and once it was used up, the engines could not be returned to flight status without manufacturing new components, which would have cost substantially more than the operation could justify. The decision to retire the aircraft was made in early 2003, less than 18 months after the return to service. Air France announced their retirement in April 2003. British Airways followed 2 days later. Both airlines set their last commercial flights for October 2003. The aircraft was going to be retired for ordinary reasons. Fuel cost more. Passengers stopped coming back. Parts ran out. There was no single cause, and there was no villain. There was only the slow accumulation of constraints on a program that had survived for 41 years by being more interesting than it was economically defensible. The Concorde was going to fly for about 6 more months. The retirement announcements came in April 2003. Air France announced first on the 10th of April. They said that their final Concorde service would operate on May the 31st, 2003, on the Paris-New York route, with airframe FBTSD operating the last revenue flight. After that, the French fleet would be retired and the airframes ferried to museums. British Airways announced 2 days later, on the 12th of April. They said that their final Concorde service would operate on October the 24th, 2003, on the New York-London route, with airframe GBOAG operating the last revenue flight. After that, the British fleet would be retired and the airframes ferried to museums. 2 announcements, 2 airlines, 2 slightly different timelines, but the same conclusion. The Concorde was going to stop flying for paying passengers in 2003, after 27 years and 3 months of commercial service. Both airlines gave the same reasons publicly. The cost of fuel had risen substantially since 2001. The premium business travel market on the Atlantic had not recovered after September 11th. Maintenance costs were rising. Rolls-Royce had withdrawn support for certain Olympus 593 components. The aircraft was no longer commercially viable. These were the public reasons. In private, both airlines acknowledged that the calculus had also changed in a less quantifiable way after the Air France 4590 accident. The Concorde had been a romantic aircraft. After 2000, it was also an aircraft that the public remembered as having crashed. The premium aura was harder to sell, and the premium pricing was harder to defend. There was also no successor program on any drawing board. Boeing had abandoned the 2707 in 1971. The Tu-144 had been retired in 1978. Aerospatiale by 2003 had merged into Airbus, and Airbus had no interest in pursuing supersonic transport. Rolls-Royce was not designing a supersonic engine. The British and French governments were not funding successor research. The decision to retire the Concorde was not a decision to wait for the next generation supersonic airliner. It was a decision to end supersonic passenger flight with no replacement. The Air France retirement came first. FBTSD, the youngest of the surviving Air France airframes, operated the final scheduled Air France Concorde service from John F. Kennedy to Paris. Charles de Gaulle on May the 31st, 2003. The flight was fully booked. The cabin was a mix of regular passengers and Air France employees. The captain on the final flight was Edgar Chillon, who had been flying Concorde since 1990. The flight was uneventful. 3 hours and 40 minutes, gate to gate. The aircraft landed at Charles de Gaulle in the early evening. There was a small ceremony at the gate. There were a few speeches. The passengers disembarked. The crew disembarked. The aircraft was towed to a hangar. Over the following weeks, the Air France Concorde fleet was distributed to museums. FBTSD itself went to Le Bourget, the Air and Space Museum just outside Paris. FBVFA went to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia. FBVFB went to the Auto and Technik Museum in Sinsheim, Germany. FBVFC went to Toulouse Aeroscopia, near the factory where it had been built. FBVFF went to Charles de Gaulle, where it remains on display. The Air France retirement was, in its way, a quiet one. There were ceremonies, there were museum dedications, but it lacked the public attention that the British retirement would receive 5 months later. The British Airways retirement was a national event. Through the summer and autumn of 2003, British Airways ran a series of farewell flights. There was a Concorde tour of British airports: Edinburgh, Manchester, Cardiff, Belfast, that brought the aircraft to parts of the country that had never seen one before. There were supersonic tourist flights, Concorde experience charters, that flew out over the Bay of Biscay and back. There were photographic flights, flown to be photographed by other aircraft, with formation flights of Concordes and Royal Air Force Typhoons over the English countryside. The British public bought tickets for these flights at unprecedented volume. The waiting list for the final month services was tens of thousands of people long. Tickets that had sold for £8,000 in 1999 sold for £15,000 and £20,000 in 2003. The Concorde, which had been losing money for 2 years, made a small operating profit in its final season because the British public had decided to give it one. The British Airways retirement schedule for October 2003 called for several aircraft to operate the final services in close formation. GBOAE would fly a scenic loop from Edinburgh. GBOAF would fly a supersonic farewell flight over the Bay of Biscay. GBOAG would fly the very last scheduled commercial service from New York to London. The captain of the final BA service to London was Mike Bannister, the chief Concorde pilot at British Airways. The first officer was Jonathan Napier. The flight engineer was David Hoyle. They had been working together for years. They had volunteered for this flight. It was October the 24th, 2003, a Friday. The flight departed John F. Kennedy at 8:30 in the morning local time, which was 1:30 in the afternoon London time. The passenger list included 100 regular paying passengers, several British Airways executives, the aircraft's chief engineer, and a small number of journalists. The cabin service was standard, with the same Krug and Lobster the aircraft had been serving for 30 years. The flight was 3 hours and 23 minutes long, which was within a minute of the median Concorde Atlantic crossing time. The aircraft accelerated to Mach 2 over the Atlantic. The aircraft cruised at 60,000 feet. The windows were warm to the touch. The cabin was full. The aircraft descended over Wales and approached London from the west. 3 Concordes were inbound to Heathrow that afternoon. GBOAE, returning from her Edinburgh scenic loop. GBOAF, returning from the Bay of Biscay after the supersonic farewell. And GBOAG, finishing the very last commercial Concorde flight in history. The 3 aircraft had coordinated their approach so that they would land in close sequence, one after the other. There were hundreds of cameras at Heathrow that afternoon. There were people standing on the rooftops of the hotels along the perimeter road. There were British Airways employees and pensioners, and family members of Concorde crew who had come out to watch. The runway was 27, right? GBOA landed first, then GBOF. And then GBOAG, the New York flight, came down out of the afternoon haze at 4:16 in the afternoon local time. The nose drooped, the visor lowered, the gear hanging in the familiar way, and rolled out and turned off the runway and began the long, slow taxi to Terminal 4. We don't have a verbatim recording of what the tower said to the captain as he taxied in. There are clips in documentaries, there are enthusiast audio files online, but the actual transmissions are paraphrased rather than quoted, so we'll paraphrase too. The tower said the things tower controllers say at moments like that, when something is ending and there is nothing to do about it. They said the cleared to stand instructions. They said welcome home. They wished the captain and the crew well. That was the last thing the tower at Heathrow said to a Concorde on revenue service. A few weeks later, G. Boag would fly her ferry flight to Seattle. FBVFA was already in Virginia. The others would scatter to museums in France, England, Germany, Barbados, New York. The aircraft ended for boring reasons. The fuel cost more after 2001. The passengers stopped coming back after the accident. Rolls-Royce stopped supporting the parts. Air France retired their fleet in May. British Airways followed in October. There was no successor program on any drawing board. Concorde had flown for 27 years and 7 months. The world had one of these once, and then it didn't. Let's go see where they live now. Speedbird Concorde 002, taxi to stand 409 via Bravo and Yankee. Welcome home. 20 Concordes were built in total. The first 2 were the prototypes, 001 and 002. The next 2 were pre-production aircraft, 101 and 102. The remaining 16 were the production airframes, 14 of which entered commercial service. Of the 20, 1 was lost in the AF 4590 accident. The remaining 19 all survive, as of the present day, in museums and preserved displays around the world. 1 is in long-term storage at Filton and is not on public view. The other 18, you can go and see. Let's walk through where they are. In the United Kingdom, GBOAA, at the National Museum of Flight at East Fortune in Scotland. She was dismantled at Filton in 2004 and transported by road and sea up the East Coast. There was no way to fly her in because the runway at East Fortune was too short for a Concorde landing. She has been fully reassembled at East Fortune. The museum has built a hangar around her, and she is on permanent public display. G. Bob is at Heathrow in long-term storage. She is not on public view in the same way as the others. You can see her sometimes from the perimeter road of the airport. G. Boak is at Manchester Airport on outdoor display with a small visitor center attached. You can walk through her cabin on a guided tour. The British Airways logos are still on her tail. She sits in the sun at the eastern end of the airport, and on summer days, the heat shimmer rises off her white skin in the same way it would have done at Mach 2. G. Boaf is at Aerospace Bristol on the historic Filton site where the British prototype was built. She was the last Concorde to fly. She flew her final ferry flight from Heathrow to Filton on November the 26, 2003, after the retirement was complete. The new museum at Aerospace Bristol opened in 2017 around the aircraft. The walkthrough is excellent. You can sit for a moment in the cabin. You can stand in the cockpit. The aircraft is in better condition than most of the other survivors because she has not been weathered outdoors. GBBDG, the second pre-production aircraft, is at Brooklands Museum in Surrey. Brooklands is where the Concorde simulator now lives, in a purpose-built building beside the airframe. For about 200 pounds, a member of the public can sit in the captain's seat of the simulator and fly a full takeoff, supersonic acceleration, and landing sequence. The simulator was the actual training simulator used by British Airways for Concorde captain currency through the 1990s. The controls are real, the visuals are real. You will not be flying the aircraft well your first time, but you will be flying it. The simulator session funds the preservation of the aircraft. It is one of the more thoughtful arrangements in aviation museum operations. In the United States, G. Boad is at the Intrepid Sea Air and Space Museum in New York, on the Hudson River next to the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid. The aircraft sits on a barge in the water during the summer months and is moved to a storage location in the winter for protection from the weather. She was returned to the Intrepid in 2024 after a restoration. You can walk past her on the deck of the museum. G. Boag is at the Museum of Flight at Boeing Field in Seattle. She is the aircraft that flew the very last commercial Concorde service, the one that landed at Heathrow on October the 24th, 2003. After the retirement, she was ferried across the United States to Seattle, and she has been in the Museum of Flight ever since. The condition is excellent. The walkthrough is good. The museum charges admission, but you can stand inside G-Boag and look at the cockpit and the cabin in a way that you can with very few other Concordes. FBVFA is at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Udvar Hazy Center near Washington Dulles Airport. She is in pristine condition. The Smithsonian's Concorde was Air France's airframe used for the inaugural flight in January 1976, the same aircraft that flew the very first Air France Concorde commercial service. You can walk under her wings. In France, FBTSD is at the Air and Space Museum at Le Bourget, north of Paris, on the same airfield where the Concorde made her public debut at the 1969 Paris Air Show. She is the aircraft that flew the final Air France commercial service in May 2003. Some of her systems are preserved in operating condition. FBVFC is at Toulouse Aeroscopia, on the airfield where the prototype 001 first flew in 1969. The museum was built specifically to house the French aviation heritage, and the Concorde sits there alongside an Airbus A300 and a Super Caravelle. FBVFF is at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, on display near Terminal 2. She can be seen from the road. There is a small viewing area. Elsewhere, GBAE is in Barbados at Grantley Adams International Airport. She arrived in November 2003 as a permanent gift to the country in recognition of the British Airways Concorde service to Barbados that had operated through the 1980s and 1990s. She is on outdoor display in the Caribbean sun, which is hard on an aluminum airframe. The condition has been described in recent years as fragile. FBVFB is at the Auto- und Technik Museum in Sinsheim, Germany, where she sits on top of a building on a steel pylon with her nose pointed upward in a permanent climbing attitude. The German museum is one of the more theatrical Concorde displays. There is a Tu-144 next door on a similar pylon in the same posture. The two cousins, finally, are parked on the same museum site. G-Boa, G-Boab, G-Boak, G-Boat, G-Boa, G-Boab, G-Boag, and GBBDG. FBTSD, FBVFA, FBVFB, FBVFC, FBVFD, FBVFF. The two prototypes, 001 at Le Bourget and 002 at Yeovilton in Somerset, the pre-production aircraft 101 at the Imperial War Museum Duxford in England, and 102 at Filton. Two production development airframes, 201 and 202, preserved in research and museum collections. 20 aircraft built, 19 still survive. There has not been an airworthy Concorde since 2003. None of the preserved airframes are flying. The few attempts at restoring an aircraft to flying condition, most notably a private restoration of FBTSD at Le Bourget in the late 2000s, were eventually abandoned. The engines could be restarted, but the airframes are out of certification, and the supply chain for components is no longer there. The aircraft sit where they have sat since the autumn of 2003. The question of whether there will ever be another Concorde is a question that comes up periodically. There have been several successor programs proposed in the years since 2003. Ariane an American supersonic business jet startup, raised hundreds of millions of dollars between 2014 and 2021, and then shut down without flying an aircraft. Boom Supersonic, another American company, is currently developing a 48-seat Mach 1.7 airliner called the Overture, and has signed pre-orders with American Airlines and United Airlines and Japan Airlines. The Overture has not yet flown its first demonstrator. NASA, in partnership with Lockheed Martin, is flight testing a small experimental aircraft called the X-59, designed to produce a quiet supersonic boom that might allow supersonic flight over land in the future. None of these are Concorde. None of them have yet carried paying passengers across the Atlantic in less than 4 hours. As of the year in which this documentary is being recorded, there has been no commercial supersonic airliner service in service anywhere in the world for more than 20 years. The world had one of these once, and we are still waiting to see if there will be another. If you want to see Concorde, you can. She is in 19 places. She is in museums and on tarmacs from Seattle to Sinsheim, from Le Bourget to the Caribbean. You can stand under her wing. You can sit in her cabin. At Brooklands, you can sit in her cockpit and fly her in simulation. At Aerospace Bristol, you can take a guided tour through the cabin where the Lobster and the Krug were served, and look at the small windows, and stand by row 8 and imagine the warm glass on your hand. The aircraft is still here. We're almost done. One more thing to say. That was Concorde. She flew for 27 years and 7 months, 65,000 revenue flights, give or take, 2.5 million passengers, 20 airframes built, 19 still surviving, in museums on 3 continents. She was the only commercial supersonic airliner that ever made money. She was the loudest commercial airliner ever certified. Her windows were the size of your hand, and the glass was warm when you touched it. At cruise altitude, you could see the curvature of the Earth. She was the result of a treaty that 2 governments wrote in 1962 to make it impossible for either of them to walk away. She was the work of thousands of engineers in Toulouse and Filton and Bristol and Derby over 40 years, almost none of whose names are remembered now. She was retired for boring reasons. The fuel cost more. The passengers stopped coming back. The parts ran out. There was no successor program. There still isn't. The world had one of these once. Next time, we're going to talk about the Boeing 747, the queen of the skies, the aircraft that flew almost the opposite of the Concorde, slower, larger, carrying 10 times the passengers, and staying in service for 50 years. For now, though, that's it. Thank you for spending this time with us. Good night. Flew almost the opposite of the Concorde, slower, larger, carrying 10 times the passengers, and staying in service for 50 years. For now, though, that's it. Thank you for spending this time with us. Good night.